Hey friends, today there are over 8 billion humans on Earth. We're everywhere, in cities, on farms, in mountains, across deserts. We've built skyscrapers, launched rockets to Mars, created the internet. No species has ever dominated this planet the way we have. But if you'd looked at Earth 900,000 years ago, the picture would have been shockingly different. There were only about 1,280 humans left. Not 1.28 million, not 128,000, just 1,280 individuals capable of reproducing. That's it. The entire future of humanity hanging by a thread so thin, it's almost unbelievable that we're here at all. And hey, if you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make these. So maybe hit subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments. Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, all happening at once. You know that feeling when you slam the brakes and barely miss an accident? That instant rush when you realize how close you came to disaster? That's what happened to our entire species. Except it didn't last a few seconds. It lasted 117,000 years of barely holding on. And here's the crazy part. No one even knew this happened until 2023. Scientists had long suspected humans went through a population crash at some point in our distant past. Our genetic diversity is oddly low compared to other animals. Chimpanzees, who live in scattered groups across Africa, have more genetic variation than all 8 billion humans combined. That's not normal. That's the genetic signature of a bottleneck. But no one knew how severe it was, or that it nearly ended us before we'd even begun. The story starts with a researcher named Wang Ji at the Chinese Academy of Sciences about 5 years ago. He was running genetic analyses on thousands of modern human samples, tracing mutations backward through time like a molecular clock. Then he noticed something strange. Around 900,000 years ago, the genetic signatures collapsed. It was like watching a movie where 99% of the characters suddenly vanish from the screen. The models were screaming that something catastrophic had happened, but the numbers were so extreme, he didn't believe them. He assumed it was an error, a glitch in the code. Because if the math was right, it meant human ancestors had been reduced to a population smaller than a typical high school. He checked, rechecked, ran new models, tried different methods. Every time, the same result. Around 930,000 years ago, 98.7% of our ancestors were wiped out. The survivors, just over 1,000 individuals, stayed at critically low numbers for more than 100,000 years. That's longer than modern Homo sapiens have even existed. You might think, so what? Species bounce back all the time. But here's the thing, they usually don't. Once a population drops that low, it enters what biologists call the extinction vortex. Inbreeding increases, genetic problems pile up, random disasters can wipe out the last few survivors. Most species that reach this point simply vanish forever. But somehow, ours didn't. For 117,000 years, our ancestors held on. Through ice ages, droughts, and the extinction of countless other species. A scattered, fragile population of early humans kept the flame of humanity alive when it should have gone out. What makes this discovery even more incredible is when it happened. 900,000 years ago, Earth's climate was going haywire. Geologists call it the early Middle Pleistocene transition, the time when the planet's ice age cycles shifted from mild 41,000-year rhythms to brutal 100,000-year ones. Glaciers grew massive, covering continents. Sea levels fell hundreds of feet, ocean temperatures plummeted, and Africa, the cradle of humankind, turned harsh and dry. Imagine being an early human, maybe Homo erectus, watching your lush homeland slowly become a barren wasteland. Rivers drying up, animals disappearing, plants dying off. And every generation, it's worse. That's what scientists call a perfect storm for extinction. Most human populations didn't make it. They died out. Only a tiny group, somewhere in Africa, survived. We don't know where or how, but they did. And here's where it gets mind-bending. During this bottleneck, something extraordinary happened in our DNA. 2 chromosomes fused into one. That's why modern humans have 46 chromosomes, while chimpanzees and gorillas have 48. Chromosome fusion is incredibly rare, maybe once in millions of years, and it happened right in the middle of our near-extinction event. When populations are that small, rare mutations can spread through the entire group quickly. If one individual had that fused chromosome and survived to reproduce, it could become universal within just a few generations. Today, every human alive carries that fused chromosome. It's chromosome 2, a genetic time capsule of those 117,000 desperate years when humanity nearly vanished. Scientists can even point to the exact spot where the fusion happened, a scar in our DNA where 2 ancient chromosomes joined together. It's like forensic evidence from the most important survival story in history. But that fusion may have done more than just change our chromosome count. Genes near the fusion site influence brain development. Some researchers believe it may have helped spark the evolution of the larger, more complex human brain. Think about that. Our intelligence, our creativity, our language, our art, our technology, all of it might trace back to a single genetic accident that occurred when there were fewer than 1,300 humans left on Earth. The evidence for this ancient bottleneck is written in our DNA, like a time capsule buried inside every cell. Every person alive today carries the molecular echo of those 117,000 years of survival. Population geneticists can literally see it, the pattern of mutations forming a mathematical fingerprint of near extinction. But for decades, no one could read that signal properly. Older genetic tools were like trying to read an entire book through a keyhole. Scientists could tell something had happened, but not what or when. They knew humanity had faced at least one population crash, probably when our ancestors first left Africa about 60,000 years ago. But no one suspected there was an earlier, far more devastating one. It took the creation of a new computational method, the fit-coal algorithm, developed by Wang Ji and his team, to finally unlock the truth. These new tools could analyze thousands of genomes at once and trace genetic changes back nearly 1 million years. When Wang Ji published his results in Science in 2023, the scientific community was stunned, not just by how extreme the bottleneck was, but by how long it lasted. Most evolutionary bottlenecks are short. A volcanic eruption wipes out most of a species, the survivors breed rapidly, and the population rebounds within a few generations. Or a deadly disease wipes out 90%, but the remaining 10% recover quickly. But 117,000 years? That's not a bottleneck. That's an extended, drawn-out near-death experience for an entire species. Nick Ashton, an archaeologist at the British Museum who reviewed the study, said it best. This would imply the surviving population occupied a very localized area with strong social cohesion to endure for so long. Of greater surprise is just how long they survived. It must have required a remarkably stable environment with reliable resources and few external stresses. In other words, somewhere in Africa, there must have been a refuge, a pocket of stability, where a small group of early humans found everything they needed to survive while the rest of the continent was collapsing under climate chaos. But where was this place? What made it different? And how did just 1,280 people manage to sustain a population for over 100,000 years? Those are the questions that still keep scientists awake at night. Some think the survivors lived near permanent water sources, maybe around the Great Lakes of East Africa, or along rivers that kept flowing even through the worst droughts. Water brings animals, animals bring food, and both mean survival. Others believe this small group had developed technologies the rest hadn't. Maybe they had mastered fire in ways others hadn't yet. And fire changes everything. It lets you cook food, unlocking more nutrients. It drives off predators. It extends the day, giving you more time to work, share stories, plan. Most importantly, it lets you endure environments that would otherwise kill you. Archaeological evidence shows that around 800,000 years ago, the use of fire suddenly surged, and that moment almost perfectly lines up with when the genetic bottleneck ended and when human populations began to grow again. Coincidence? Probably not. But there's something even stranger. The fossil record from this entire period, roughly between 950,000 and 650,000 years ago, is almost empty. Anthropologists used to call it the fossil gap. Now we know why. There simply weren't enough humans left to leave fossils behind. With only about 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across an entire continent, the odds of any one of them dying in the right conditions for fossilization were almost zero. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, except the haystack is the size of Africa, and there are barely any needles at all. The few fossils we do have from this time mostly come from Europe and Asia, not Africa. That suggests those individuals might represent side branches of humanity, groups that weren't directly part of the main bottleneck. It makes sense. Africa is vast and diverse. While some regions became unlivable, others might have stayed stable enough to support life. But the genetic evidence is crystal clear. The ancestors of all modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, went through this same catastrophic bottleneck. We're all descendants of those 1,280 survivors. Every single one of us carries DNA from that tiny population that refused to give up during the worst climate crisis in human evolutionary history. Scientists estimate we lost about 65% of our total genetic diversity during that time, an enormous blow. For comparison, the famous founder effect, when modern humans left Africa, only reduced diversity by about 15%. That loss still affects us today. It's part of why humans are unusually vulnerable to certain diseases, why our immune systems are weaker than many primates, and why genetic disorders that would be rare in more diverse populations are surprisingly common in ours. In a strange way, our weakness is proof of our greatest triumph. Every genetic flaw we carry is a reminder that our ancestors survived when they should have perished. But survival wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something new. Around 813,000 years ago, everything changed. The population of early humans began to grow again, not slowly, but explosively. Within a few thousand years, the descendants of those survivors had spread across Africa and beyond. They invented new tools, hunted larger animals, built shelters, controlled fire more deliberately. Most importantly, they began the evolutionary journey that would give rise to three extraordinary species: Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and the mysterious Denisovans. The timing is too precise to be coincidence. The genetic data suggests the last common ancestor of all three species lived right around the time the bottleneck ended, as if near extinction didn't just test our ancestors, but forged them, as if it transformed them into something tougher, smarter, more adaptable, something capable not just of surviving a hostile world, but mastering it. Ye Huan Pan, one of the scientists behind the discovery, put it this way: this finding opens a new field in human evolution, raising questions about where these individuals lived, how they survived the catastrophic climate changes, and whether natural selection during the bottleneck accelerated the evolution of the human brain. That last part, natural selection during the bottleneck, might be the key. See, when populations are tiny, evolution works differently. In large populations, beneficial genes spread slowly over hundreds of generations. Harmful ones take time to fade. But in a population of barely 1,000 individuals, evolution moves at lightning speed. A single helpful trait can sweep through the entire population in just a few generations. Those with even the smallest survival advantage quickly dominate the gene pool. For 117,000 years, our ancestors lived inside an evolutionary pressure cooker, a world that demanded intelligence, cooperation, adaptability, and resilience. Generation after generation, those traits were refined, sharpened, and passed on until they became the foundation of what makes humans so remarkable today. The bottleneck wasn't just something our ancestors survived, it was something that made us who we are. Now imagine what that actually looked like. It's 930,000 years ago, and the world is ending, not with an explosion, not with an asteroid, but slowly, brutally, one failed harvest at a time. You're part of a tiny band of early humans, maybe 30 or 40 people. Your species doesn't even have a name yet. Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis. Scientists still argue about that. What matters is this: you are human enough that your children's children's children, thousands of generations later, will become us. And right now, you're watching your world die. The forests your parents hunted in are turning to scrubland. The scrubland is turning to desert. Rivers that once ran year-round are now just dry beds of cracked mud. Your group keeps moving, chasing water that keeps disappearing, following herds that grow smaller every season, clinging to hope that's fading with every generation. This isn't a drought. Droughts end. This is the new normal. Earth's orbital patterns have shifted into a nightmare. Ice sheets in the north are growing massive, locking away so much water that sea levels drop by hundreds of feet. The Mediterranean shrinks into scattered lakes. Land bridges appear between continents. But it's not the ice itself killing your people. It's what the ice is doing to Africa. As the glaciers expand, they warp global weather systems. The monsoon rains that once fed Africa's great rivers weaken and collapse. The skies dry out, the land cracks, and for 117,000 years, the ancestors of every human who ever lived walk the razor's edge between extinction and survival. What once was woodland turns to grassland. Grassland fades into desert, and desert becomes nothing. Scientists have a name for what happened to Africa during this time: aridification. The continent didn't just get drier, it became catastrophically dry. Fossil evidence tells a grim story. Vast herds of large mammals vanished. Antelope species that had thrived for millions of years disappeared completely. Elephant populations collapsed. And when the big animals die, everything else follows. Predators starve, scavengers starve, and for early humans, who depended on both, the choice was simple: adapt or die. Most didn't make it. But your small band, those 1,280 surviving humans scattered across Africa, found something others missed. Perhaps it was a mountain range that still trapped rain clouds, maybe an underground aquifer that fed a few stubborn springs, or a deep rift valley that held its own gentle microclimate. Whatever it was, it kept your ancestors alive for 117,000 years. But survival didn't mean progress. Forget the idea of evolution as a steady climb toward greatness. During the bottleneck, there was no advancement, no invention, only endurance. Your band likely lived in tiny groups of 20 or 30, extended families where everyone was related to everyone else. With only 1,280 breeding individuals across the whole planet, choice wasn't luxury. Inbreeding was inevitable. Genetic disorders, birth defects, developmental issues, all were common. But somehow, you endured. Life was brutally simple. Wake up, find water, find food, avoid death, repeat. For 100,000 years, water always came first. In a world where streams dried for half the year, knowing where to find it was everything. Your people developed an uncanny ability to read the land, to sense where hidden springs slept beneath the soil, to predict which seasonal rivers would flow longest. They may have dug the first primitive wells, rough holes scraped with sticks and stones, but enough to keep a family alive through the dry season. Food was harder. With large game wiped out, hunting couldn't sustain you. You became what scientists call dietary generalists, eaters of anything and everything. Insects, always insects, termites, crickets, beetle larvae. They were dense with protein and fat, endlessly renewable. Roots and tubers became staples too, plants that hid underground, safe from the burning sun. You learned which were edible, which were poisonous unless prepared just right, and which could be stored for the long, lean months. You stole eggs, bird, reptile, any you could find, timing raids to harvest just enough to live without wiping out the next generation. And when fortune smiled, there was meat, not mammoths or giant beasts. They were long gone, but an injured zebra, a dying elephant, a stray young antelope. This is when fire became salvation. Early humans had known fire for ages, but during the bottleneck, it became the difference between life and death. Cooking made food safer. It killed parasites, softened fibers, unlocked calories the raw world kept hidden. Cooked roots turned poison into nourishment. Cooked meat gave more energy than any raw flesh could. Fire changed not only the stomach but the mind. It extended the day. When darkness fell and predators prowled, fire gave light. It allowed humans to work after sunset, to sharpen tools, patch shelters, and share discoveries about where to find food and water. But most importantly, fire gave them time to talk, to remember, to teach. In these long nights, something else was forged: connection. With so few people, every life mattered. Conflict could be fatal, not to one person, but to the whole band. So your ancestors learned cooperation. They shared resources when they could have hoarded them. They settled disputes without blood. They cared for the sick and the injured instead of leaving them behind. They shared knowledge because knowledge was survival. When one person found a spring, everyone learned about it. When someone discovered how to make a toxic root edible, that skill spread instantly. When a hunter perfected a new way to track prey, it became common knowledge within days. Information became the currency of life. And with so few minds left, losing one meant losing a world's worth of experience. So they began to teach, obsessively. They developed memory traditions, spoken lessons passed down from elders to children. They taught not only how to live, but why to live, how to see patterns in nature, how to sense the coming rain, how to make and fix the tools that held existence together. The children who learned fastest survived longest. Those who could remember and teach carried the tribe forward, and over time the human brain began to grow, slightly, but measurably. Fossils show larger cranial sizes after the bottleneck, because when survival demands thought, nature selects the thinkers. But it wasn't just intelligence that evolved, it was empathy. Social intelligence, living in small, fragile groups, demanded it. You learned to read faces, moods, intentions. You developed what scientists now call theory of mind, the awareness that others think differently than you do. This ability to predict, to understand, to cooperate, became humanity's secret weapon. Even the few tools we've found from this era tell the story. Stone blades became more consistent in design, more standardized, as if small groups were teaching each other, spreading techniques across vast distances. Archaeologists call this cultural convergence, separate groups inventing similar tools at the same time because they were communicating, trading, learning from one another. Those 1,280 survivors weren't one single tribe. They were scattered, perhaps groups of 20 or 30, separated by hundreds of miles, each isolated yet faintly connected through shared ancestry, trade, or the exchange of knowledge and mates. This structure, called a metapopulation, is what saved them. When one group vanished to drought or disease, others endured, repopulating the empty spaces. It was evolution's version of insurance, a living web that refused to break. For 117,000 years, this fragile network of humans played a deadly game of survival. Some generations thrived in good years, others perished in silence, but the lineage endured. Then, around 813,000 years ago, something changed. The skies softened. Rain returned. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough. Grasslands began to spread again. Rivers that had been dry for ages began to run. Animals returned. And by then, your ancestors were no longer the same beings who had entered the bottleneck. 117,000 years of suffering had shaped them, sharpened their minds, their cooperation, their resilience. They had learned to manage fire, to craft better tools, to share food and wisdom across generations. They had become the blueprint for us, so when the earth finally eased its grip, they were ready. Their numbers exploded. Within a few thousand years, their descendants spread across Africa, then into Europe and Asia, carrying every skill, every adaptation, every spark of intelligence that had kept them alive. These were not ordinary humans. They were the survivors of extinction, the ancestors of everyone alive today. Each of us carries their legacy, genes sculpted by fire, drought, and determination, proof that even at the edge of annihilation, life can find a way to endure. The world became livable again, and the story of humanity, our story, was just beginning. Animals that had vanished from entire regions begin to reappear, cautiously at first, a few herds on the horizon, then more, spreading across plains that had been empty for millennia. And your people, battle-hardened, climate-forged, evolutionarily refined, surged across the recovering world like nothing the planet had ever seen. Within just a few thousand years, a heartbeat in evolutionary time, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors multiplied into hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. From their hidden refuge somewhere in Africa, they fanned outward, reclaiming territories long abandoned, expanding into every corner where life could once again take hold. But what happened next wasn't just a story of population growth. It was one of transformation, the greatest branching point in human evolution, because that genetic bottleneck, that near extinction, hadn't just reduced our numbers. It had reshaped the rules of evolution itself. Around 800,000 years ago, that single rebounding population began to divide, splitting along three separate evolutionary paths that would give rise to the most successful human species in history: modern humans, Neanderthals, and the Denisovans. Normally, speciation, the process of one species becoming many, unfolds slowly over millions of years. But the bottleneck had compressed everything. 100,000 years of brutal natural selection had spring-loaded human evolution. When the population finally expanded, it didn't just spread, it erupted, bursting outward in multiple directions at once. Imagine a great river forced through a narrow canyon for 100,000 years. When the pressure finally releases, the water doesn't simply flow. It explodes outward, carving new channels across the land. That's what happened to humanity. The first branch stayed in Africa. They would one day give rise to Homo sapiens, though they weren't modern yet. still refining the skills that had kept them alive through the drought and darkness. The second branch journeyed north and west into Europe and Western Asia, where they faced an entirely new kind of world, cold, seasonal, and unpredictable. There they adapted swiftly. Within a few 100,000 years, these populations developed powerful, stocky builds, broad chests, and enlarged nasal passages, all perfect for retaining warmth in Ice Age climates. They became the Neanderthals. The third branch turned east, spreading across Asia, from the mountains of Siberia to the islands of Indonesia and New Guinea. Though they left fewer fossils, their legacy endures in our DNA. We know them as the Denisovans. Their genetic signatures still appear in modern populations from the Philippines to Tibet, silent traces of a species that once ruled the East. All three groups carried the deep genetic imprint of the bottleneck, reduced diversity, a fused chromosome, and the neural traits honed during 117,000 years of relentless selection. But as they spread into new worlds, each began to evolve along its own path. In Africa, the survivors faced a landscape still in flux, wet, dry, fertile, barren, sometimes all within a single lifetime. To survive it, they had to be adaptable, inventive, quick to learn. Natural selection began to favor intelligence, not brute strength, but flexibility of thought. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this population developed the hallmarks of what we now call modern humanity: larger brains relative to body size, lighter skeletons, and the capacity for symbolic thinking. They began to imagine, to plan, to create, laying the foundations for art, language, and abstract reasoning. The seeds of our species had been planted. Meanwhile, the Neanderthals were becoming something else entirely. Europe was harsh, long winters, fleeting summers, scarce food. They met it head-on. Neanderthal bones tell a story of strength unmatched by any other human, dense, powerful, sculpted by cold and struggle. Their large nasal passages helped warm frigid air. Their massive muscles powered through endless hunts. Their brains even grew larger than ours, adapted to the challenges of Ice Age life. But their most profound adaptation wasn't physical. It was cultural. Neanderthals mastered the hunt. They weren't scavengers anymore. They were strategists, coordinating drives, ambushes, and traps to take down mammoths and bison. They preserved food through long winters, likely using natural ice and caves as primitive refrigeration. And they began to bury their dead, deliberately, with care, sometimes with objects laid beside them. It was the dawn of ritual, a moment when survival gave way to meaning. Far to the east, the Denisovans followed their own remarkable path. They spread across Asia with astonishing success, adapting to environments that ranged from tropical islands to high-altitude plateaus. Some populations evolved genetic variants that let them process oxygen efficiently in thin air, traits still present in modern Tibetans today. Others became skilled seafarers, reaching islands that required open ocean travel, suggesting the invention of early maritime technology long before any other human species. And yet, for all their differences, these three groups were still connected. They weren't separate worlds. They were branches of the same great family tree, occasionally meeting, mingling, and sharing genes when their paths crossed. When modern humans left Africa around 60,000 years ago, they interbred with Neanderthals. Later, both mixed with Denisovans in Asia. DNA tells the story clearly. Multiple encounters across millennia. The legacy of the bottleneck had united them all at the deepest level. Despite hundreds of thousands of years of divergence, they still shared the same core blueprint, the same fused chromosome, the same genetic tools shaped in the crucible of extinction. They were separate species, yes, but kin nonetheless, carrying the same ancient spark of resilience that had once saved humanity from disappearing altogether. Each group had become a living experiment in what it meant to be human. 3 different answers to the same question: how to survive on a planet that never stopped changing. And from those ancient experiments, the modern world was born. The archaeological record from this era reveals something extraordinary: an explosion of innovation, creativity, and complexity. And it wasn't confined to one group of humans. It was happening everywhere, across Africa, Europe, and Asia, all at once. In Africa, stone technology began to evolve with breathtaking speed. The crude choppers and hand axes that had defined early human life for millions of years gave way to sleek, specialized tools, finely shaped spear points, scrapers, and blades designed for precise purposes. Even more remarkable, tool-making became standardized. Sites scattered across Africa show nearly identical designs, suggesting ideas were spreading far beyond the limits of any single group. This marks a turning point, the dawn of cultural evolution. For the first time, knowledge was moving faster than genes. Innovation was no longer bound to biology. It was being shared, taught, refined, passed from mind to mind. In Europe, the Neanderthals were charting their own path of brilliance. They invented the first hafted tools, stone blades and spear points attached to wooden shafts with animal sinew and plant resin. It might sound simple, but this was revolutionary thinking. To make a composite tool, you had to imagine multiple materials coming together into a single functional design, a level of abstraction that required foresight, planning, and true engineering sense. Neanderthals also pioneered what archaeologists call prepared core technology. Instead of randomly chipping away stone until a sharp edge appeared, they learned to pre-shape stone cores so that multiple identical flakes could be struck from one piece of rock. It was manufacturing, systematic, efficient, and repeatable. They weren't just making tools anymore, they were producing them. Further east, the Denisovans were innovators in their own right, though their story comes to us mainly through genetics rather than artifacts. DNA evidence suggests they were the first humans to systematically use plant-based medicines. Modern Asian populations still carry Denisovan gene variants that protect against plant toxins, a sign their ancestors had learned to harness poisonous plants for healing and adapted biologically to survive their use. Some scientists even propose that Denisovans took the first steps toward proto-agriculture. Genetic traits that help modern Asians digest starchy foods may trace back to them, hints that they were experimenting with the cultivation and processing of wild grains long before farming as we know it began. But perhaps the most profound revolution of this period wasn't in stone or bone, it was in society. Across the post-bottleneck world, humans began weaving complex social networks. Extended families joined with others to form broader alliances. Trade routes emerged, carrying raw materials and finished tools across hundreds of miles. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was organization. The first fragile threads of civilization were being spun. The genetic record captures this shift. During the post-bottleneck expansion, human populations began showing signs of structured breeding, not random pairings, but deliberate exchanges of marriage partners between groups. That means kinship systems had formed, rules about who could marry whom, who belonged to which lineage. It hints at gift exchange, shared rituals, and cooperation between distant communities. This was the social glue that would one day allow small bands to grow into tribes, chiefdoms, and much later, the first states. But even that wasn't our species' greatest invention. Something deeper was taking shape, something invisible but world-changing. Language. No one knows exactly when language began. Words don't fossilize, but all the evidence points here, to this very period, as the time when communication took its great leap forward. The rapid spread of standardized tools tells us that complex information was being shared with precision. The emergence of trade and alliance networks implies negotiation, planning, and abstract thought. And the ritual burials of Neanderthals speak of symbolism, of meaning attached to the unseen. Everything fits the same pattern: scattered groups, small populations, stretched across vast landscapes, needing to stay connected. They had to share knowledge about food, shelter, and danger, to teach and learn faster than ever before. In that crucible of survival, language became the most powerful adaptation of all, a tool not made of stone or wood, but of sound and thought, capable of reshaping the destiny of every human who spoke it. Under such unforgiving conditions, even the smallest improvement in communication could mean the difference between life and death. Those who could speak a little more clearly, understand a little more precisely, or pass on information a little more effectively, had a clear advantage. They found food more easily, avoided danger more often, and taught their children better. And over hundreds of generations, that advantage compounded. Natural selection began to sculpt the human voice, ear, and mind into tools for language far beyond anything found elsewhere in the animal kingdom. By the time the three great human lineages met again, modern humans encountering Neanderthals in the Middle East, Denisovans meeting both in Asia, they were no longer limited to grunts or gestures. They could speak, they could share knowledge, forge alliances, trade ideas, even tell stories. Stories about their ancestors who had endured the great dying nearly 1,000,000 years before. But the world was changing once again. After hundreds of thousands of years of relative abundance, the earth was filling up. The same fertile lands, once empty and welcoming, were now contested. The three species of human, Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, and Denisovan, were beginning to compete directly for territory, for resources, and for survival itself. The long era of isolation and cooperation was ending. The age of rivalry had begun. Then came the meeting that would alter the course of all human history. Roughly 60,000 years ago, a small band of Homo sapiens, descendants of the African survivors who had endured the bottleneck, began to move north. They crossed the narrow straits between Africa and Arabia, not realizing that they were about to rediscover lost cousins, relatives separated by nearly 500,000 years of evolution. For hundreds of millennia, three human worlds had grown apart. In Africa, modern humans had honed adaptability and innovation. In Europe, Neanderthals had mastered endurance and strength. And across Asia, Denisovans had become pioneers of high altitudes and deep forests. Now their worlds were colliding. The first meeting likely happened somewhere in the Middle East, perhaps along the sun-baked shores of the eastern Mediterranean. There, small groups of African migrants would have wandered into the southern edge of Neanderthal territory. Imagine that moment. You are part of a small group of explorers, modern humans, stepping into a land no one in your kind has ever seen. Then, across the valley, you notice movement, shapes that look familiar yet strange. They walk upright like you. They carry tools, wear hides. But their faces are heavy with bone, brow ridges like ledges of stone, noses broad and deep. Their bodies are thick, compact, powerful, built for the ice and the cold. Neanderthals. What did your ancestors feel in that instant? Curiosity? Fear? Wonder? We can't know for sure, but we do know what came next. Because the proof is written inside us. They didn't just clash, they connected. Modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, not once but many times, over thousands of years. They exchanged more than genes, they shared survival itself. Today, every person of non-African ancestry carries about 2% Neanderthal DNA, a living echo of those ancient encounters. A reminder that when our species met, we didn't always choose violence. Sometimes we chose cooperation, even love. But peace was never permanent. The Middle East at that time became a revolving door between species. As the climate warmed, modern humans surged north into Europe and Asia. When it cooled again, Neanderthals pressed south to reclaim the same lands. For tens of thousands of years, the balance swung back and forth, with the shifting climate dictating who ruled the fertile valleys and who retreated into the mountains. It was a delicate, endless dance between cousins, one that would shape the destiny of every human who came after. Thanks for watching To Be Continue. Wait for next part, please subscribe.